20 years ago, in June 2000, I was one of 12 members of the Arkansas Court of Appeals and was one of 6 judges involved in deciding an appeal from a decision by a trial judge in Little Rock, Arkansas, brought on behalf of a man named Sean, C-H-O-N, Lionel Johnson. It's Johnson versus State. For those of you who are legal nerds, the court citation is 70 ARK APP 343. It's a 2000 case. I was one of 2 dissenting judges. The case was a 4-2 decision. The case was initially heard by a 3-judge panel, and under the rules of our Court of Appeals then and now, if the 3-judge panel is unanimous, then that decision, the decision of the 3-judge panel, becomes the decision of the court. If the decision of the 3-judge panel is not unanimous, then it has to go to an additional panel of 3 judges to decide. If that 3-judge panel is equally divided, then it has to go to a 9-judge, to a 3 other judges, to a 9-judge panel. In Mr. Johnson's case, our initial 3-judge panel was not unanimous, and so the case was expanded to another 3-judge panel. Because I was on the initial 3-judge panel and was in the minority in the initial decision and in the minority in the final outcome, I was the author of the dissenting opinion. What I'm going to share with you now are excerpts from the dissenting opinion I wrote in John Johnson versus State. I have a longer version of this presentation on another video, but in the interest of convenience and for those who may not want to spend as much time as the 30 minutes as the longer version requires, I am going to share what hopefully will be a shorter version. I'm reading from my dissenting opinion. Courts stand as havens of refuge for those who might otherwise suffer because they are helpless, weak, outnumbered, or non-conforming victims of prejudice and public excitement. Citing from Chambers, Chambers versus Florida, 309 U.S. 227, it's 1940 decision. By affirming appellant's conviction for disorderly conduct because he used profanity in questioning the validity of a police officer's actions, the majority turns its back on this vision of the judicial function that Justice Hugo Black of the Supreme Court of the United States asserted more than 50 years ago. The majority does so despite a long line of decisions holding that anyone is free to verbally challenge police action. Although the majority properly rejects the state's transparent assertion that appellant's decision to challenge the sufficiency of the evidence is procedurally barred, its decision to affirm is reached by what is plainly a de novo exercise that cannot be justified according to the proper standard of appellate review. And the majority opinion comes in the face of overwhelming evidence that the police based their contact with the appellant on a racist judgment, that he, a black man, did not belong where a police officer saw him and was not entitled to assert his right to be left alone using profane, yet not incendiary language. I will not support a result that legitimates double standards in our criminal justice system and adds judicial endorsement to occupation force police conduct in poor and minority communities. Instead, I would reverse and dismiss the disorderly conduct conviction and hold that the record is insufficient to support it. The facts. On the evening of May 1st, 1998, Sean Johnson, who is partially paralyzed, visited his great aunt and uncle who lived at 511 Ray Road in Jacksonville, Arkansas. While there, Johnson received a message that his girlfriend was stranded on Valentine Road. So he phoned for a cab, talked with his aunt while he watched the news until sometime between 10 and 10:30 p.m., and then stood outside his aunt's house to await the cab. Officer Mark Swaggerty of the Jacksonville Police Department was patrolling the south end of town and driving in the 500 block of Ray Road when, according to his trial testimony, he, quote, noticed a black male standing on the corner of the road, and as I approached him, he was getting real nervous and started pacing and looking back and forth at the patrol unit. I got out and asked him his name. He immediately became hostile. The first words out of his mouth were, quote, "Why are you F-ing harassing me?" Close quote. I could smell alcohol on him. He began to walk away. Due to his violent behavior, I called for another officer to come over there, Officer Mayberry. Other than his cursing, just the way his actions were indicated that he had a violent demeanor. The way he was yelling, cursing, his look and attitude toward me. This conduct lasted the whole time during the whole event. Just the smell of alcohol made about him and the way he was acting indicated he'd been drinking. Close quote. Do you notice how the officer's testimony indicates his notion that Sean Johnson somehow was suspicious of criminal activity just by the virtue of where he was? A black man was deemed suspicious simply because he was standing in a residential area late at night outside, and simply because when he was approached by the police, he wanted to know why the police officer wouldn't leave him alone. Why would the police officer assume that he somehow had to explain his reason for being where he was? And that was something that Sean Johnson had a right to ask. And he had a right to ask it however he pleased. He had a right to ask it in a low tone of voice or a cursing tone of voice. But notice that the initial officer, Officer Swaggerty, took that response from Sean Johnson as sufficiently indicative of criminal activity to detain him and to summon another police officer, Officer Thomas Swaggerty, to respond to assist Swaggerty with, according to Swaggerty's testimony, he responded to assist Swaggerty with a belligerent individual that he was in contact within the 500 block of Ray Road. Notice again, Swaggerty assumed that Sean Johnson was a criminal just because Sean Johnson acted like he didn't want to have to deal with the police. The bottom line was, Mayberry testified that he continued trying to calm Sean Johnson down while I waited some verification from our dispatcher. and also just to get him to reduce what I perceived as a very agitated state on his part. You should know that the police officers, four police officers responded to Sean Johnson, and four police officers attacked Sean Johnson. One of them sprayed pepper spray on him. Then two of them began hitting him with their baton when he went to his aunt and uncle's porch and would not go with them. They basically took him to the ground, placed him in custody. Afterwards, Sean Johnson's great aunt and uncle verified that they knew him, confirmed that he had visited him that evening, confirmed that he was waiting for a cab, yet he was arrested, charged with disorderly conduct, terroristic threatening, fleeing, resisting arrest, and public intoxication. The trial judge eventually found Johnson guilty of disorderly conduct, not guilty of public intoxication, not guilty of terroristic threatening, not guilty of fleeing. However, the trial judge denied Johnson's lawyer's motion for directed verdict, saying, "I'm going to deny the motion on disorderly conduct. Obviously, he's cussing." And announcing his decision, finding Johnson guilty of disorderly conduct, the trial judge stated that while it was a close call whether the police had probable cause to stop and arrest Johnson, quote, "Even if that's a close issue, I don't believe at that point in time he has the right to cuss the police officer." And it kind of escalated from there, close quote. In my dissenting opinion, I made clear that the U.S. Supreme Court has long held that people have a right to criticize the police. I wrote, "The Supreme Court has unequivocally stated that the First Amendment protects a substantial amount of verbal criticism directed toward law enforcement officers. The court also stated that the freedom to verbally criticize actions by the police without the risk of arrest is one of the primary distinctions between a free nation and a police state." This is what I am trying to break apart. Notice that the very idea that people would criticize the police has been upheld by the judges in the case of Sean Johnson as a reason to view him as disorderly. He cussed the police. He cussed the police loudly. He did not threaten the police, but he cussed the police, and the fact he cussed the police is viewed as grounds to treat him as a criminal. And then I wrote, in my opinion, and I'll close after this because I spend more time on the longer version of this. This case stands as stark proof about continuing racism and inequality in the American criminal justice system and the failure of police departments, prosecutors, and the courts to address the conclusion of the 1968 Kerner Commission report on civil disorders that, quote, "many disturbances studied by the commission began with a police incident," close quote. It is unmistakably clear that appellant was approached by Officer Swaggerty because he was a black man standing on a public street at night in what the police termed a high crime area. The high crime area where appellant stood happened to be where his relatives lived. He had a right to visit his relatives and stand on the street outside their home while awaiting the arrival of a cab, the taxi, without being accosted by the police. The police had no basis whatsoever for suspecting that he was engaged in, had committed, or was about to commit a crime. Although I disapprove of appellant's profanity, I denounce Swaggerty's initial engagement with appellant, the way that appellant was treated by 4 police officers after he disapproved of Swaggerty's approach, and appellant's prosecution and conviction for disorderly conduct as racist. Swaggerty's testimony proves that appellant's race, presence at night, and desire to be left alone caused Swaggerty to view him with suspicion. That racist judgment triggered this case. Somehow the police deemed appellant's obvious and understandable irritation about being deemed suspicious due to merely being present and unwilling to interact with them as justification to require him to submit to detention while they attempted to verify his account. The fact that the majority avoid even addressing this egregious proof signals police and prosecutors that, in the mind of some judges on this court, the police can act as if black men have no right to be in public unless the police approve of their presence and the way they behave, even absent prima facie evidence of criminal conduct, and not be censored. Some observers would deem that a tacit concession to the idea of a police state. I will conclude by saying that Sean Johnson took an appeal to the Arkansas Supreme Court. I regret to tell you that the Arkansas Supreme Court affirmed his disorderly conduct conviction. Apparently, being black at night near your relative's house and asking the police, "Why are you effing harassing me?" is a crime in Arkansas. Apparently, the First Amendment doesn't cover it in the eyes of some judges. Decisions like this are what give police officers the sense that they can treat black and brown people as they please. And so, if we intend to fix the problem of abusive and homicidal police officers, we also need to fix the judges.